This was an opportunity to sit down and explore what the possible avenues of engagement might be.
And what are the prospects that the United States and North Korea can sit down?
Right now, you've got a lot of gamesmanship going on in advance of the launch of any formal negotiation.
Putting the sanctions on North Korea leading up to this, telling the North Koreans that we're not backing off of.
The administration is saying to the North Koreans, if we're going to talk to you ever, it's not going to be for a while.
Denuclearization should not be the precondition for negotiation. It should be the end objective.
So to get to denuclearization without a war begins with an understanding that North Korea needs to find a pathway to security.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eunjang Cho. Vice President Mike Pence was set to hold a meeting with North Korean officials during the Winter Olympics, but North Korea canceled hours before the meeting. How can the U.S. and North Korea find common ground to start talks in the future?
Wanted the honor of meeting with men and women who fled the tyranny of North Korea to hear your stories.
Now my guest today, Mr. Ken Gause, the director of CNA's International Affairs Group. Mr. Gause focused on the North Korean leadership for the last 30 years. Also joining me, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation. He was a former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Nice to be here.
Good morning. Frank, let me begin with you. North Korea offered to hold talks with the United States 2 weeks before the Olympics, but canceled 2 hours before the meeting. It seems the two sides had different ideas about the meeting. How far apart are they?
Well, I think the two sides are very far apart, in part because the United States wants to focus almost exclusively on North Korea's nuclear capacity. And the North Koreans, for their part, have announced that they consider that to be something they don't want to negotiate about, at least not under the current circumstances, and really want to focus on what they call the removal of America's hostile policy. Now, ordinarily in a negotiation, this would be somewhat typical, and the two sides would sit down together and put all the issues on the table. But right now, you've got a lot of gamesmanship going on, with both sides, I think, trying to shape this environment in advance of the launch of any formal negotiation. And for the Trump administration in particular, I think they are afraid to look weak in the run-up to talks if they ever get started. So they're trying to really drive a very hard bargain, essentially demanding that North Korea meet their negotiating terms in advance. And the North Koreans are having none of it.
Ken, do you want to add to why the meeting was canceled?
Well, I think possibly the meeting may have been canceled because of the statements that the U.S. was making, especially Vice President Pence. Very hard line. He had meetings with the family of Otto Warmbier, as well as defectors. He visited the Cheonan. And this basically sent a signal to North Korea that the U.S., if they were to meet, was probably going to lecture North Korea on the need to give up its nuclear program, its human rights violations, and they were not going to put Kim Yo-jong, the sister of the supreme leader, in a position where she's going to be lectured to.
I think Ken makes a really good point. I mean, the vice president and the president himself have wanted to put the human rights issue on the agenda. It was featured prominently during the State of the Union address by the president. And I think that's fine. But there's a time and a place for when to put that issue front and center. And I think in the run-up to what could have been very valuable exploratory talks with high-level North Korean envoys, for the United States, for the vice president to highlight that, I think it was sort of boorish, amateurish from a diplomatic standpoint. And I think the North Koreans took offense and decided at the last minute to pull out of those talks.
So, Ken, do you put more emphasis on the fact that this almost happened or the fact that this was canceled?
In my opinion, it was an opportunity lost. This was an opportunity for the U.S. and North Korea to sit down and explore what the possible avenues of engagement might be. what the art of the possible might be. And unfortunately, we were not able to pull that off.
United States' latest round of sanctions comes before the closing ceremony at the Pyeongchang Olympics. What is the signal here, Ken?
I think this is basically sending a signal both to North Korea and South Korea about the U.S. position. The U.S. is not in any mood right now to negotiate without precondition. And I think putting the sanctions on North Korea leading up to this is, telling the North Koreans that we're not backing off of our policy. And it's telling South Korea that any plans that President Moon may have had to try to persuade the U.S. To soften its position is probably pretty much a no-go.
Frank, is the United States interested in sitting down with North Korea at all?
Well, the signals they're sending right now are that they don't think it's the time for engagement. They seem to be sending all the signals right now that they want to see the pressure build in advance of any possible talks. The president himself has, over the last several weeks, gone back and forth with mixed messages about his willingness to have dialogue with North Korea. But the announcement of sanctions on the eve of the closing ceremonies of the Olympics, to me, strongly suggests that Ken is right, and that the administration is saying to the North Koreans, if we're going to talk to you ever, it's not going to be for a while. We want the pressure to build on you. We want you to absorb the seriousness of your situation.
So we've just discussed how far apart North Korea and United States are. But do you have any ideas how we could keep the denuclearization still on the agenda, but still bring North Korea to the table?
Well, I don't know if we had the magic solution, I think we'd both get Nobel Peace Prizes and we would have shared it with the governments in advance. I don't think there is a magic solution. There's no silver bullet to this. But in order to keep the prospect of denuclearization alive, we have to understand why the North Koreans are pursuing weapons of mass destruction in the first place. And that's because they feel profoundly insecure about the future of their country and the future of their regime. They believe they need these weapons in order to survive. So to get to denuclearization without a war begins with an understanding that North Korea needs to find a pathway to security that is of equal value and equal reliability for them as what they are deriving from their pursuit of nuclear weapons. So this is a negotiation where we have to come up with a security future for North Korea that they consider to be of equal value to their nuclear weapons. We have to give something to get something.
From my point of view, what we have done in U.S. strategy is to put the cart before the horse. Denuclearization should not be the precondition for negotiation. It should be the end objective. And if you put the denuclearization as the end objective, what you should be focusing on right now is the possibility of a freeze. North Korea has not proven that it can mate a warhead to a missile. It has shown that it has very significant problems with re-entry capability. But these are things that North Korea will achieve if they're allowed to test over the next year or so. So what we should be doing is trying to figure out how can we freeze that program. And the way that I would say that we need to do it is first, let North Korea have a turnkey program. They get to keep what they have for right now. And basically, why do you do that? So that they stay invested, because if they believe that you're going to just take their nuclear weapons, you may not follow through on your agreement. So they get to keep the nuclear weapons. Then you're probably going to have to seal that with some economic and security guarantees. And in return, they promise not to test, not to proliferate, and not to conduct provocations. We have to give a little, they have to give a little.
South Korea is planning to send a senior diplomat to Washington next week. What should be the elements that should be fine-tuned between the two allies in managing North Korea, Ken?
Well, I think, and it makes it very problematic given the possible the sanctions that are coming down today. But the Moon administration needs to find out how much flexibility there is in the U.S. position. Because if he cannot go to North Korea without something to offer, otherwise he has absolutely no leverage to keep North Korea invested in negotiations. And so I think that probably that meeting will be to explore Is there anything we can put on the table to get the North Koreans to come to negotiating?
Well, it's hard for Seoul to play matchmaker, especially since really the tough security issues that North Korea has with the American position need to be solved directly by talks between North Korea and the United States. But I think President Moon is trying to afford the United States opportunities to interact with North Korea. I hope he will continue to try to make those opportunities happen because the dialogue has to start somewhere. And since the North and the South are talking about humanitarian issues, about North-South relations, it gives the South the opportunity to put the Americans in the room. The South Koreans have to figure out if they have a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un, what, if anything, can they do on the security front? I think it's also important to discuss upcoming spring exercises. Those need to be coordinated. And finally, there really needs to be, I think the South Koreans need to assess how serious is the Trump administration about the risk of a preventative attack, a preemptive strike on North Korea. I think there's increasing nervousness in Seoul that may be where the Trump administration is headed.
Before we go, my last question regarding the future. First to Frank and then to Ken. What are the prospects that the U.S. and North Korea can actually sit down for, at least for talks?
An attitude of diplomacy requires some minimum level of mutual respect. I think that's what's missing right now. There's no respect in either direction.
Ken, what are the prospects that the United States and North Korea can sit down for at least talks about talks?
I think there's very little possibility of that right now because both of the sides, North Korea and the United States, have dug in their heels on their respective positions. It is now basically being seen by both sides as a black and white sort of zero-sum game, that any compromise made on one side is a victory for the other side. And that really makes it very difficult to break through to negotiations.
We'll have to end this conversation here and move on to our second topic. Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yojong, got much media coverage during the Olympics. Who is she and what is her role in the Kim regime? Now, Ken, you've studied the North Korean leadership for 30 years already. What is Kim Yojong's official role in the government and how powerful is she?
Her official position is she's an alternate member of the Politburo, was promoted at the 7th Party Congress to that position. She is also a vice director of the Propaganda and Agitation Department, the Central Committee, which is probably the second most important department within the Central Committee. And she is tied to Kim Jong-un's personal secretariat. She's the person who keeps his schedule. When we first started to see her in the 2012 timeframe, even 2011 timeframe, she was almost like a little girl. When we would watch Kim Jong-un's guidance inspections, she would be off in the side, sometimes picking flowers or something. And now, over the years, we have seen her mature and grow in terms of her roles and responsibilities, where we often now see her at Kim Jong-un's, right close to him, basically providing directions about the people around him. And we suspect that, going forward, that's only going to grow, and she's going to become much more of a face of this regime.
Frank, do you think Kim Yojong successfully fulfilled her mission to the South Korean Olympics?
I don't know how the North Koreans viewed it. I think from an American perspective, her mission had mixed results. It's impossible for any propagandist or messenger to erase the knowledge of North Korea's human rights abuses, their proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So I don't think that was a realistic objective for her, but I think she softened the international perspective of the North. She humanized North Korea. And she also, I think, represented North Korea with a kind of a pride and a kind of a, if you will, a sort of a sophistication that caught many people off guard. And while she may have been an attractive face on the TV, I don't think that she did a lot to really change people's fundamental perceptions of North Korea.
Ken, Washington Post called her the Ivanka Trump of North Korea. Do you agree?
Partly. She is a family member who has the ear of the leader. She probably has a broader portfolio than Ivanka Trump does, but she probably does not provide the level of advice to Kim Jong-un yet. She's being groomed to take that role, but she probably isn't there yet. I think probably Ivanka Trump has probably more sway in terms of the policy area vis-a-vis her father than Kim Yo-jong has with Kim Jong-un.
Frank, how would you compare Ivanka and Kim Yo-jong?
Well, I mean, it's almost ludicrous to try because they've come from such completely different backgrounds. And I think Ken's point that both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are mistrustful of professional advisors, mistrustful of the governments they lead to some extent, and rely heavily on close blood family connections for advice, for counsel, for consolation. In that sense, I think that they fulfill very similar roles, Ivanka and Kim Jong-un's sister. But apart from that, I think they're very different people. And according to information that the U.S. government has put forward, Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong herself, may be linked to or tied to human rights abuses in the North. And there's no such evidence, obviously, of Ivanka Trump being involved in comparable activities. So they're very different people.
Ken, before we go, how would you describe the North Korean regime? Is it a communist regime or a dictatorship?
It's a hereditary totalitarian regime on top of a communist bureaucracy that has elements of a mafia family. But even though people describe it in very bizarre terms and try to put it in convenient boxes, we need to understand that North Korea has its own equities, its own objectives and goals that we need to take seriously.
I agree with Ken, and the key thing to what he said, I think, is that this is not a monolithic state. It has structures, it has bureaucracies, it has party and military and family, and we need to understand that each of these have their own points of view and their own interests.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Now, the photo today is a cartoon on The Blade, a daily in Ohio. The title is North Korea's Charm Propaganda. The cartoon is about an ice skating duo with a Western man at the bottom named Media holding up Kim Jong-un. On Kim Jong-un, it says North Korea's Charm Propaganda. Frank, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the criticism of the media on handling of the Kim Yo-jong visit to North Korea, to South Korea, is really unfair. I don't think that they tried to glamorize her. And I also think that the charm offensive of the North was as likely to be found offensive as it was charming by many of those watching. But nonetheless, I love the fact that here you've got North Korea playing on the world stage. And from my perspective, that's a good thing. Let them try to put their best face forward. Let's see how it sells. And let's have the international community have a chance to interact with North Koreans rather than view them just in isolation.
Ken?
I agree with everything that Frank said. It's interesting here. It seems to be a perspective of Trump's worst enemies, the press and North Korea, supporting each other. And I think that's unfortunate because the American public needs to know that this is a very serious situation. And we need as much information as we can about North Korea in order to be able to solve this problem.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Frank, Ken, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from VOA, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Thank you for watching.